Hello again, I'm Tristan Zhukovsky of the New York Historical Fencing Association. So today I'm going to answer another question that's been asked of me quite frequently recently, which has to do with cutting swords and which sword might be best for you as a practitioner, as a student. Today specifically, we're going to be looking at a spread of Albion longswords, and unlike most reviews, we're not going to be discussing the quality differentials. I've always found that Albion swords have had a stellar, consistent quality about them, so this is not going to be about relative merits of individual swords. I do want to talk about the relative merits of each and every sword I have here in terms of its utility as a training tool, specific to practicing cutting and cutting mechanics. A very important concept is that when you're cutting through material, be it tatami or sometimes also water bottles or melons and things like that, is that the cutting through material should not be considered as practice. That should be feedback for practice for every time you manipulate a sword. With that being said, a very valuable trait for swords to have is the loudness. I mentioned in passing the concept of the sword wind, or tachikaze, as it's referred to in Japanese, and this has to do with how the blade physically moves through the air and distorts the air around it to give an auditory feedback of that cut. Why this auditory feedback is so important, as far as I'm concerned, is it gives you a lot of good information about cutting mechanics. We're talking about velocity, we're talking about consistency of edge alignment, and we're also talking about where energy is focused in the arc of whatever cut it is you're performing. Wider the sword is, the more it disturbs the air while it's passing through it, and generally speaking, that creates a louder sword. That doesn't necessarily mean that sword is going to be great for cutting through material, and we're going to explore this concept in just a moment. But the converse of that is that the easier to cut with swords, those that are thinner and broader, sometimes are much more quiet. So really what I'm looking for in terms of an ideal sword for cutting purposes and for practicing cutting mechanics is kind of those middle-of-the-road swords that exhibit both those characteristics. Something that has very good auditory feedback, but something that's also somewhere on the optimization scale closer towards a cutting sword rather than a thrusting sword. I'm not going to get into great detail about the different edge geometries and how those fit into the different sword typologies, but if you want more information, I can certainly recommend one great book, which is Okashot's Taxonomy of Swords. This has become such industry standard in terms of referring to different blade types and other physical characteristics as well. If you'd like to delve even deeper into sword geometries beyond just a taxonomy standpoint, but more from an artistic perspective, a physics perspective, even a musical perspective, I can strongly recommend this book, which is The Sword, Form, and Thought, which has a bunch of excellent articles, many of which have been written by Peter Johnson, or co-authored by Peter Johnson, who is a world-renowned swordsmith. So in speaking of the sword wind, I'd like to first introduce the four loudest of the Albion longswords that I have personal experience with. The Albion Fiore, or in fact any of the Type 15As. The Albion Earl, or any of the Type 18Bs. The Albion Cressy, which is a Type 16A. And the Albion Brescia Spadona. So another concept that I want to discuss has to do with the relative ease in which certain sword types cut. For example, I have here an Albion Alexandria. This is a Type 18C. This is, quite clearly, very much optimized for cutting. However, that does not make it a good practice sword. That may sound a bit counterintuitive, but one of the problems is something like this that is so good at cutting can very easily mute some of the finer details in technique, because to a certain extent it is a bit self-correcting. That's not to say that this isn't a great sword to have, and personally this is one of my favorites. However, as a training tool, I think that it could prove worse off because it won't give you all the negative feedback that you might otherwise get from other swords. So I'd like to contrast that with the Albion Fiore, which we've already heard. Clearly this is much more optimized for thrusting rather than cutting. I have cut with it. It can cut. But given that it's so thick, given the blade type, it's going to make cutting a little bit more difficult and potentially lead to bad habits in terms of an overcompensation with force. Again, this can mute some of those finer details in terms of the subtleties of technique. I want to give a brief mention to the Albion Count. This is a Type 13A. What I love about this is, as a sword of war, a great sword, it is very thin, very light, and very broad, so excellent for cutting, so long as you treat it as though it is a heavier sword. What I mean by this is, given the fact that it's so light, it's sometimes too easy to attempt to muscle through just with upper body strength. You have to treat this as any other sword and achieve that same tip velocity, which is really much more of a mental trick than anything else. Once that mental paradigm switch occurs, and you're able to give this the body mechanics that it needs behind the sword, again, I mean treating this as a heavier sword, the lightness will make for much more rapid follow-up shots. Continuing with that idea that for the sword practitioner, especially a beginning sword practitioner, you want a balance between a sword that is very loud for that auditory feedback and a sword that is also a capable cutter, I want to recommend two swords in particular. The first is my old love, the Albion Cressy. This is the Type 16A. Not only is this perhaps one of the more affordable Albion swords, but I think that the blade type is excellent for new students. A perennial complaint, however, which you will hear, including sometimes for me, is that it does have a rather short grip, but this is not something that is necessarily a detriment to technique. It will require a little bit of adjustment, but beyond that, I think this is a stellar sword. One last sword that I want to talk about, and this is a sword that I've just had some very recent exposure to, is the Viceroy. This is a Type 20A. I love this sword. I've just begun cutting with it, and it is a bit heavy. The mass distribution is tip leading. But I think it also fits well in that range of good sword that punishes bad technique but rewards good technique. I'm still getting used to this sword, but I think that this is definitely a sword that should be considered for beginning students. One of the great things about Albion, as I mentioned before, is the quality is always consistently high. The other thing is that they offer a wide variety of types of swords, be it differences in blade types, or just the hilt furniture. This allows sword practitioners to choose really a sword that speaks to them on a personal level. And this can be based on aesthetics, or it could be based on something such as fitting within a specific time period or a geographic provenance. Again, I'm approaching this decision-making process much more from the perspective of a teacher. All of these swords are wonderful, but I find that some are much more suitable for the student of swordsmanship rather than others. My final recommendation would be find someone who owns one or more of these swords and try them out for yourself before making a commitment to them. As with any tool, familiarity is key in its use and learning how to use it in the most optimal of ways. Given my familiarity with all these swords that we talked about today, if you have any further questions, feel free to contact me personally, or of course you can always leave a comment below. As always, stay tuned for more videos, and thanks for watching.